Why is Africa poor? As an African, you cannot help but wonder and ask yourself, how did we fall behind? It's clear for all to see, for the longest time, Africa has been on the economical and technological back foot. Once you start asking these questions, you get the usual answers. Oh, it was colonization, or neo-colonization, or neo-colonialism. But the problem I have with that is, how did we get colonized in the first place? For another people to dominate your people for centuries, they had to have had an advantage already. They had to have some edge over you, either a technological or organizational advantage. So colonialism was a problem, but that problem was created by an already existing problem, which is the vast difference in technology and organization. If you look at the wars that were fought in South Africa, we were comparing Maxim guns and howitzer cannons to spears and cowhides. So, as valiant as the resistance was, the difference was glaring and it could only end in one way. The second reason people mention is corruption. This is the current explanation and it is still alive and well. The problem with this view is that there's a huge power difference between the African leaders and the average African, say in a poor village. So expecting a poor woman in the village to exert enough influence over a politician with the local and international networks is really asking too much. The citizens of developed countries are in far better positions to exercise their influence in order to stop corrupt politicians from looting. This shows that the people in a poor African country are already less developed politically and economically. How I like to sum up that argument is it's almost like saying that, or they're almost always saying that if we stop corruption, we'll be able to develop Africa. But you're already conceding that Africa was already less developed. And that's the question, how did it get less developed in the first place? I would like to take a different approach. Since everybody is playing the blame game, I would have to do the same and blame it on the Romans. Yes, the Romans from centuries ago. To me, it's not so much about what the Romans did than what the Romans didn't do. Let's start with Roman cities. Now, the impact of the Romans on the modern world is truly immense, but to really understand how important these guys were, here's a quick list of the cities that were founded by the Romans. Rome, of course, Rome, London, Zurich, Salzburg, Barcelona, Manchester, Vienna, Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Istanbul, then called Constantinople, and even Paris. These are some of the greatest cities on the face of the earth. Today, these are international, commercial, and trade hubs with large population centers. The Romans were masters at building cities. They knew how to build a strong, solid city. From forums to amphitheaters, these guys knew what a city needed, and these guys knew how to build what was needed. See, the thing is, cities heighten a civilization by pushing the trades such as blacksmithing, shoemaking, or weaving to the highest level possible. And as the trades develop, the quality of life of the people also develops. Cities are key political, economical, and cultural engines, and the Romans built some of the greatest cities. Many dynasties would rise and fall, but these cities are legacies that still live with us today. And then there's the Roman road. The great Roman cities were connected by a vast network of roads. You see, The Romans were masters at building roads. They built hundreds and thousands of kilometers of road. The Roman road was the backbone of their empire. Even after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Roman road networks were the backbone of early Europe. These roads facilitated quick communication. A rider on horseback could get a message to a distant part of the empire. Troops could be sent quickly to project the authority of the state at the furthest edges of the state, which is vital for security. And in a lot of African countries today, the state does not have that projection capacity. These roads also led to smoother trade, since goods can be transported much more easily. Besides troops and goods, ideas could also be transmitted along these roads. For instance, Christianity. One could ask, would Christianity have grown without the Roman roads? Personally, I doubt it, because the early Christian leaders used the connectivity of Roman roads extremely well in order to spread their ideas. We could say that there was a diffusion of ideas, and if something was invented and then innovated in one part of the empire, if that thing was useful and permitted by the authorities, it would spread very quickly, finding its way to the other side of the empire. That's the nature of technology. It proliferates across society. For instance, when bronze swords were first rendered useless by iron swords, everyone had to quickly catch up or risk being destroyed. So from Germany to Turkey, from France to Egypt, these societies would not fall too far behind in terms of the latest civilizational developments. It's not that one society was better at innovation than the others, it's that any useful innovation could rapidly be made available to all these societies. So that's the problem with Africa, except for the north parts of Africa, where the Romans did have a presence for a prolonged period of time, such as Tunisia or Egypt. The quality of city building in Africa was not as advanced as the Romans. I don't see that there was much of a difference between a city like Paris before the Romans and the foundational typical African cities. The Romans called Paris Lutetia. Even pre-Roman Zurich in Switzerland was not very impressive and could have ended up like any other African city. If you look throughout history, cities were amongst the most important political, economic, and cultural entities. Even today, some cities are wealthier than countries, and the Romans were excellent city builders. Africa lacks strong cities that are highly interconnected. So this then limits the amount of innovation, ideas, and goods that can be transported across Africa. This means that security will also be a problem because a centralized state needs to be able to deploy troops effectively to far parts of its country in order to enforce the authority of the state. And the fact that these cities themselves are not optimal economically means that they won't have enough money to equip those troops, even if they could send them to the far reaches of the country. So whereas roads and cities in countries that were part of the Roman Empire were growing for centuries, African cities were growing much slower. The Roman dedication to law was also another thing that benefited these Roman cities and also the cities that existed in what was once the Roman Empire. That's why I think Africa is poor, because the Romans never conquered Africa. They never built great ancient cities to a high standard here. They never built highly connected roads which could allow for an easy access or transfer of technology, ideas, trade, and goods. It's not so much what the Romans did, but what they didn't do in Africa. Look at the parts of Africa where the Romans had a presence. These are some of the most beautiful cities. These are some of the most alive cities in the world, especially in North Africa. Colonization in the modern industrial capitalist age could not have built such a great legacy because it was more extractive. People had to make money. But with the Romans, they had a religious dimension to the things that they did. For them, roads had to do with one of their gods. So communication, commerce, and travel had an aspect of divinity to them. Maybe it was the geography of Africa that overwhelmed them. But then again, we know that the Romans controlled the Nile when they had Egypt. We also know that the Eastern Romans had relations with Ethiopia. Could they not have used that as a starting point? Furthermore, we know that Hanno, the explorer from Carthage, made his way to West Africa much earlier in history than the birth of imperial Rome. So the Romans could have established themselves in that way. Whatever the reason, I think that the Romans not coming to Africa properly and early was a great loss to history. I know it seems strange for an African to argue for colonization. I find it strange too, but the Romans were special. The Romans were great. The legacy of the Romans is unmatched in history. I believe that Africa would be radically different if the Romans had established themselves here. The legacy and legend of Rome will echo in the halls of eternity, and maybe, just maybe, like the founders of America took a sip from the Roman goblet when building their political and architectural structures, maybe, just maybe, Africa needs to drink from the cup of the eternal city. Maybe we need to drink from the cup of Rome.